I am extremely delighted to welcome Brian Lin. Thank you so much, Brian, for joining us today. So for those of you who are, who are not familiar with Brian's work, he is a veteran science communicator with over 20 years of experience. After leading the media training program at the University of British Columbia in Canada, he moved to AAAS EurekAlert, which is one of the world's largest science news platforms, and where he currently, as Banya mentioned, oversees the editorial content strategy. And so Brian very generously agreed to have a sort of an informal, interaction with communication officers and communication professionals who are interested in finding out how they can leverage research communications or for increasing the impact and visibility of institutions. Brian works a lot with various communication officers around the world. So I'm sure Brian will have a lot of very useful pointers for those of you who are based at institutions across the world. So with that, Brian, over to you. I think as we discussed, we'll keep the format of this session very informal. And once Brian finishes his presentation, maybe we can switch on our videos and our microphones and ask questions to Brian directly. So with that, over to you, Brian.
So thank you for having me. I'm so thrilled and privileged to participate in this session. As Sarah said, it's the end of your day. You've heard some really, really inspiring talks. So my goal for this session is to provide a little bit of international context, and I will try to be fast and somewhat entertaining, if I may, and then we'll open up for questions and go from there. First of all, I come from the American Association for the Advancement of Science, or AAAS. It is the world's largest multidisciplinary scientific society. We were established in 1848 and now have about 120,000 members worldwide. Now, most people know AAAS as the publisher of the Science family of journals, but we're actually a lot broader than that. Our mission is to advance science for the benefit of all people, and we achieve this through a number of programs. Fellowship for Scientists, public engagement programs, and the program that I work in is called Eurekaler, and it is a news release distribution system that is designed to help the exchange of information between academics, researchers, and members of the media, and then by extension, the public. So I'll talk a little bit more about Eurekaler later on, but for now, just sort of take this quote as a reference that Eurekaler is kind of like a giant virtual press conference that is always taking place where information is being exchanged. So the agenda today is I figured that you've all heard a lot from other experts about how to do communication, tips on reaching to the public. What I thought I could provide is a slightly different angle at leveraging research, which is the sort of human resource infrastructure aspect of this. I think oftentimes we forget that the most important element of communication activities is the people. And so I like to share some of the experiences that I have personally had, and also some of the structures that many universities around the world adopt as a bit of a reference or maybe inspiration of what you might be able to do. So I'll talk about the role of public information officers. I think a lot of you are already doing this job, and the key functions of a PIO office. Then I'll talk a little bit about Eurekaler and some of the resources that we offer. So first of all, let me define the term public information officer. So we call this PIO. And what we're really saying is that, you are communicating, you're a communication professional, and your main job, your main goal is to communicate information to the public. Now, there's a lot of variations to this role, right? Sometimes you can call it a communications officer. You could be called a public relations professional or media relations specialist based on what what the mix of your job is. But we sort of lump all of these roles into sort of a profession we call the PIO. Now, there's one distinction that I would like to make is that usually when folks use the word PIO, or public information officer, they're somewhat distinguishing between sort of the nonprofit academic communication from the for-profit corporate communications. And so typically, if you hear people say PR, they're usually, referring to the more corporate side of things, where when we talk about PIO, it's usually the more academic or nonprofit government agency aspect of things. Now, one interesting aspect about the job of a PIO, public information officer, right? Your job is to provide information to the public, but you actually serve multiple masters. Well, of course, like you work for an institution. So ultimately, right, your loyalty is to the institution or the publisher that you work for. And, you work with researchers to communicate their information. So you are, I wouldn't say beholden, but you need to stay loyal. You need to stay true to the information that they provide. Now, a lot of the public information officers interact with members of the media, reporters and journalists a lot. And so to a certain extent, right, you are serving reporters and their needs to communicate to the public as a conduit to your ultimate goal. And so finally, right, I think the ultimate goal of a public information officer is to provide transparent and useful information to members of the public. And many of us who work for taxpayer funded organizations or nonprofit organizations with a mission-driven goal is ultimately we want to be accountable to the public for the scientific research that we publish or conduct. And so it's really important to keep in mind that as a public information officer, sometimes you're going to be pulled in many, many different directions. And, for me personally, that was actually the aspect that was the most interesting for me to sort of juggle these different considerations and different obligations. So as Sarah mentioned, I started my career in science communication as a media relations officer at the University of British Columbia. And, my main responsibility was fairly typical for a PIO, which was to identify and support media relations opportunities, namely through news releases and pitching. Now, keep in mind, right, I started that job in 2001. And in today's world, right, like that was like the dinosaur age for communication. But, I think the main components of communication to the public have definitely changed over time, but I think the principles have stayed largely the same. And so at UBC, a big part of my job is to turn something that looks like this, with words with a lot of syllables that I cannot pronounce, into something that looks like this. And hopefully, from a news release like this, you get media coverage, and hopefully the story goes viral. And so I think that in addition to doing this, one of the most sort of rewarding aspects of my job towards the second part of my tenure at UBC was to design and deliver media training to faculty and students. And I think this is a really important consideration for anyone who's working at institutions of any size, is that it's being a PIO isn't just about passing documents. It isn't just about sending news releases out to reporters. It's actually has a lot to do with cultivating the capacity within your organization to provide that activity. So I'll talk a little bit more about this in the Q&A as well. But so in general, SciComm roles are somewhat defined based on sort of your interaction with other people. And so I really like the idea of the word relations in media relations, because I truly believe that, the best PIOs in the world are masters at juggling relationships. They're masters at maintaining good relationships with folks that perhaps have different agendas and different priorities, but in a way, they're all working towards an ultimate goal of serving the public. So this sort of flow chart here is an attempt to sort of simplify a lot of those relationships and the flow of information. So you typically, as a PIO, your work starts with interacting with the scientists. So hopefully, they know about your office. They tell you that they've got a paper coming down the pipe that's important, or they have some important message that they would like to share with members of the public. And then through either publisher PIOs or institutional PIOs, you work up the communication strategy and the communication materials to promote this information. And then you go through some sort of distribution service, either Eurekaler or a commercial company, or even, if you develop in-house media lists, you use your own method of distribution. And that information ultimately gets to news editors and reporters who produce independently reported articles, and that information then gets sent out to the public. But ultimately, the goal of a PIO isn't necessarily to serve as gatekeepers of information, even though a lot of us do serve some of that role in some situations, like crisis management, for example. But ultimately, the goal of a PIO is to foster relationships between the scientists and the journalists and reporters that cover them, and also to foster the capacity for scientists to communicate directly to members of the public, right? So these different activities and different relationships are not necessarily mutually exclusive. They can happen at the same time. They can happen over a long period of time. Now, one thing that I wanted to share is sort of this very common model of communication hierarchy, if you will, at many universities and organizations around the world. And this is what I sort of term a central distributed model. And now, many of the institutions that I've worked with have connections with use sort of a version of this model, right? So typically you would have a main communications office that maybe sit under, say, VP communications or external affairs or variations of that responsibility. And this office is sort of serves as the central clearinghouse of official organizational information. So in the case of UBC, during my time, it was called UBC Public Affairs, and now it's called Communications Office. So there's different variations of that office, but there's typically a main office that sort of serves as the central clearinghouse of official information. And the PIOs who sit in this office, they typically represent the university as a whole. So their responsibilities often will cover major university announcements like grant awards, like major donations, right? Like major sort of announcements, buildings, that type of institutional news. But usually there will be some staff who are dedicated to communicating research outputs, or sometimes even sort of teaching output if teaching is the main pillar of that organization. And so in these cases, sometimes it gets split even finer down to folks that mainly focus on media relations like I did, or folks that also focus on institutional communication or sort of stakeholder communications. So now, usually at the various faculties and departments, some departments will also sort of decide to invest in communication activities. And we see this a lot in sort of medical schools, business schools, large faculties that have a lot to communicate, and that perhaps the central office can't fully sort of satisfy their communication needs. And so, in the US and Canada, for example, a lot of medical schools have its own communication facilities, own communication channels, and they work sort of independently but collaboratively with the main office. And so, this is just an idea to sort of put out there so that when you work with international partners and when you work with international organizations, that you get a sense of, who am I talking to? Am I talking to the main office folks who represent a university, or am I talking to sort of the counterpart of the scientists in my department at a different university? And they may have different roles and different responsibilities and different priorities as well. Now, I was at UBC for 13 years, and over that time, I definitely felt that both my personal responsibilities and the office's focus shifted over that 12 years, right? So when I first started, my job was very much focused on media relations. My job was to identify research stories that have media potential, write a news release, maybe work with the researchers on key speaking notes, do a little bit of training, and in a way sort of release them into the world to interact with journalists. And our sort of our main output was those news releases that ultimately turned into mainstream news coverage. Now, over the 12 years, I would say maybe 6 years in, we started to see a shift, right? Not only in our own university's priorities, but in other universities' sort of work, is that we're starting to see sort of the proportion change a little bit from dedicating 100% of our time to media relations to dedicating some of our time to our own vehicles, like our own websites, our own sort of distribution systems. And I think part of it has to do with fewer and fewer journalists in general, and certainly fewer and fewer specialized journalists that focus on science communication. And so, we felt like there is perhaps a bit of a void that needs to be filled. And there's also the availability of technology and channels, right? Like, I think in the mid 2000s, major universities start rolling out their own news websites, like Harvard and MIT. I think were some of the first to start rebranding their communications website or public affairs website to news. So instead of Harvard Communications or Harvard Public Affairs, they became Harvard News. So, organizations started wanting to own their own channels or manage their own channels of communicating directly to the public. And I think a big part of that has to do with having the available technology and channels to do that. Now, something that's quite particular in science communication is that not all research stories lend itself to mainstream media coverage. And I think if you do media relations, you probably share some of these frustrations with me, in that some of the toughest stories, or perhaps some of the most necessary stories to tell, because they're so undertold, right? And I often hear complaints from basic science, fundamental scientists saying, math doesn't get enough attention, or basic physics doesn't get enough attention. But if you put cute panda in front of the audience, everybody loves it, right? And so not all research stories lend itself to mainstream media coverage. So I think when organizations think about their communication strategy, they start to move away from relying 100% on news releases or media relations to doing some of their own communication engagement. And so finally, what we're seeing at Eurekaler as a sort of clearinghouse of communications content is that the content format then start to match the intended audience and channels. News releases are written in a very specific format, right? Your job is to get the reporters interested in stories, and they can expand on it. So you're usually pretty brief, you're usually pretty straight to the point. But as PIOs start producing content with perhaps a secondary audience of direct to public communication, they start producing content that is more like a news story, or sometimes even like a feature story, because the intended audience is different. So in general, there's a lot of different entry points into the PIO role, or science communication as a profession. A lot of us came in from journalism. Some of us come in from communications or PR training, but a lot of PIOs now are scientists who love communicating and want to make that their life's career. So they're entering the PIO profession as a scientist with scientific background. And so my own sort of journey to science communication is fairly serendipitous. I was born and raised in Taiwan. I got an English degree from National Taiwan University. Then I received a journalism degree from UBC, and then interned at a sort of new media segment on CTV National News, and that was really sort of my first foray into science communication, right? Talking about technology, and at the time, right, websites was still fairly new. And so we sort of explored the way that new technology like iPods and sort of single player video games and websites, and how they sort of interact with the lives of the public. And then shortly after that, I joined the UBC Public Affairs Office in 2001 and took over the science beat in 2005 because I had that previous experience working in a tech unit. And then finally, I joined Eurekaler in 2004. So I thought I sort of livened this up a little bit by sort of doing a quick online quiz of what I call SciComm 101, which is some of the sort of the basic ideas that hopefully I have conveyed, and basic ideas that we sort of adhere to. So if you could play with me and scan this QR code and start filling out the survey. We'll talk over the questions once you're all done. All right, so if everybody's got the QR code, I'm going to go to the first question. All right, so I'm going to quickly read through this as you walk through them. First question: a PIO's duty is to reporters, the institution, researchers / scientists, the public, or all of the above. Second question: the main job of a PIO is writing. True or false? Question 3: I must have a science degree to work as a PIO. Item number 4. Oh, I think somebody raised their hand. Okay, item number 4, I must have perfect English to work as a PIO. Number 5, science communication only promotes the benefits of science. Number 6, my job is done when the news release is sent. Number 7, I should write a news release for every paper our scientists publish. Number 8, science reporters are doing science communication. All right, thanks for playing. I will send along the results if you fill out the SurveyMonkey. I'll send along the results to Sarah to share with participants so you can kind of see what other people said. So here are my interpretations of these questions, right? And so, as I mentioned, a PIO serves multiple masters, and you have to sort of juggle those multiple relationships. So your duty is to all of the above, right? To reporters, to institutions, to researchers, scientists, and the public. And again, I thought that was the most interesting part of my job, is to sort of, in these crevices of priorities, to sort of find the perfect messaging, right? That meets everybody's needs. And even if it doesn't meet everybody's needs, it meets enough of everybody's needs that most people are not angry, right? And I personally really enjoyed it, and I hope that you do too. The main job of a PIO is writing. Now, this is a really interesting sort of can of worms, right? Because a lot of us come out of a writing background, right? And so I think that most communicators start their job, doing some sort of writing. And yes, a big part of your job is writing. You could be writing news releases. A big part of my job is writing emails, right, to scientists, find out what they're doing, learn about their research, right? And then finally writing the news release, and then emailing, pitching the reporters, and getting feedback from them. A big part of my job was writing emails, right? But I would argue that, writing is simply the tool, right? The vehicle for you to get to that ultimate goal of communicating the information to the intended audience. So I would say that, the main job is maintaining those relationships and keeping those relationships alive, other than just the writing. I must have a science degree to work as a PIO. You can see me as an example of a PIO who does not have a science degree. My mother is still flabbergasted that I work at a scientific organization, right? Because I was so bad at science when I was growing up. But, you know, because a lot of PIOs now have a science background, folks almost feel like they need a science degree just to be a science communicator. And I would argue that, you know, folks with science background or without come into the profession with very, very different benefits to the profession, right? Because I was so bad at science, I was very motivated to explain science in a way that people like myself that don't have a science background can clearly understand the benefits and challenges of science. And so, you know, I always almost wear it as a badge of honor that I don't have a science background and I did poorly in science when I was a kid. And now, you know, my job is to make sure that people like me understand the science. But folks who come into the profession with a scientific background sometimes will save a lot of time, right, with some of the tougher materials. But I would argue that if you are typically working at an organization with multiple departments and faculties, you're likely going to be communicating a subject matter that you didn't study in. And so in some sense, right, you are sort of serving as that novice for the discipline that you weren't trained in. And so, you know, I would say you do not need a science degree as a PIO. It is certainly considered to be a plus if you're looking for a job. But, you know, for the most part, folks aren't requiring a science degree to fill a communications position. I must have perfect English to work as a PIO. This is one of the questions that comes to me a lot from our international colleagues, right? Like folks that were trained in Chinese, Japanese, Korean, in French, German, right? Anybody who is not a native English speaker. And what I would say to this is that, you know, because a big part of a PIO's job is to try to communicate to the largest cohort of the public as possible. Sometimes using sort of big words is discouraged. And in fact, a big part of our job as PIOs is to sort of translate those jargons that scientists are so used to, right, into languages that common folks can understand. And so, again, you know, I don't believe that you need perfect English to work as a PIO. In fact, you know, to a certain extent, we strive to make communication as plain language as possible. And again, you know, if you happen to speak multiple languages, that is definitely a plus because more and more institutions now are starting to pay more attention to members of the public whose first language isn't English, and that, you know, that they also have a right and an interest in information, scientific information. Now, science communication oftentimes focus on the benefits of science. And this is where there's been a lot of there's a lot of soul searching, I think, in both science communication and science journalism about how research information, science research information is being communicated. I think if you go to websites, the news websites, and open newspapers these days, you'll see most science-related stories are somewhat positive. They talk about the latest advances and how it's going to sort of benefit members of the public. But there's relatively few stories about the challenges of science. And as part of AAAS, we really believe that to serve science in the highest degree, we have to be transparent about not just the benefits, but the downsides and the challenges of science. And so, this is something that we at AAAS believe in very deeply. And a lot of the scientific community has now started to think of this as a big part of their goals and aspirations. Number 6, my job is done with the news release is sent. So, a lot of folks think that, if you're a media relations officer, once you've written the news release, you push the send button, your job is done, right? I would often think of it as sort of just the start of my job. So, if you think about sort of communication as sort of throwing a party, right? The news release is just the invitation. It's just the sort of starting point of getting your audiences excited about something. And so now to make sure that that news release turns into an engaging and accurate story that is going to be consumed by members of the public, there's a lot of work that needs to be done between working with the journalists to help them get what they need, right? I remember scheduling interviews for my scientists because the story was so popular that I had to find 15-minute increments in the day in the scientists' the teaching days, right, to get them to talk to reporters. And so a lot of this again is about maintaining those relationships and making sure that ultimately what you put out in the world is accurate and engaging, and so that the information isn't distorted or inaccurate. Number 7, I should write a news release for every paper our scientists publish. I would say that there is often the pressure to do that, and the pressure could come from either your leadership, right, research leadership, or your communications leadership to put out as much content out there as possible. And you might get repeat customers, right? Like scientists that worked with you and had a really good time, and now they have more research they would like you to share with the public. And so this is where I think personally that the most challenging part of the job is, which is looking at the material and looking at your intended audience and connecting with the researchers about what their goals are. I found that oftentimes, especially right with some of the sort of tougher incremental research findings, what the researchers are looking for is for their colleagues to learn about their work and not necessarily for the general public. But because most of the time scientists' vocabulary in communication is limited. They when they think about communication, they think about news release. So they come to you and say, I want a news release, but maybe they don't, right? Maybe what they want can't be achieved through a news release. So I would encourage you to always think about what the goals are, both your institutional goals, your office's goals, but also ask the question to your customer, to your clients, to the scientists. What are your goals in doing this? And sometimes you might find out that what their goals are quite different from what the vehicles that you have, and you may need to retool what you do with them. Finally, science reporters are doing communication, science communication. So I wanted to throw this in here because there's been a lot of discussions in the science communication and science journalism community about the role that science journalists play in communicating scientific information. As I mentioned, there's been a lot of soul searching, about how a lot of science journalism has been overwhelmingly positive, and that science journalists perhaps should aspire to be as critical of scientists as, say, political journalists are of politicians. And so, one thing to keep in mind is that there's a huge gradient, right, between the pure journalists and the pure PR people. And, in today's world, especially if you're a freelancer, right, sometimes you skirt the line. And so in terms of terminology, right, I like to say science communication, what I'm thinking about institution-sponsored, institution-created material. Sometimes, right, most of the time it has a public, a positive slant. Again, I would encourage you to always, provide the caveats and the state the challenges of any given communication. But when I think about reporters who work for mainstream publications, I like to refer to them as science journalism as opposed to science communication. So I'll quickly go over what Eurekaler is, in case it's a tool that might be useful to you as a PIO. Eurekaler is an editorially independent news release distribution platform. We were established in 1996, so we celebrated our 25th anniversary this year. It's a free resource for journalists and the public. So journalists can create an account and receive email notifications and embargoed content. If the term embargo isn't familiar to you, the news embargo system is sort of a gentleman's agreement between publishers of scientific papers and journalists who would like to cover that content. And so typically, a publisher would set a specific embargo for an issue of the journal or certain papers, and journalists have to agree that in order to receive that information in advance, sometimes up to a week or two in advance, to review the papers, to interview the authors, to gather third-party commentaries, that they would hold their stories until embargo time, which typically coincides with the time that the papers are published. And Eurekaler is supported by institutional submission fees. So, you know, if a university wants to send news releases through Eurekaler, they pay a one-time fee or annual fee to submit news releases, and that's how we keep the operation going. We currently have about 17,000 reporters and freelancers registered with us from around the world. You can kind of see the makeup of our reporter members. About half of our reporters are US based, about 10% are UK based, and the rest of them run the gamut, and they're actually currently have reporter registrants from 99 countries around the world. We have about 7,000 public information officers registered with us. Again, about 50% of our PIOs are from the US. And currently we have about 121 reporters from India. That's just less than 1%. And both reporters and journalists have to apply and meet the eligibility criteria in order to be a member of Eurekaler. Our content sources, so when I say content, I'm talking about news releases that are submitted to us. About 62% of our content as of 2020 was from the United States, and about 92% of US R1 research universities have submitted content to us, and about 25 to 50% of the world's top ranked universities, based on which list you consult, have submitted content. So we're fairly widely used by research intensive universities around the world. We saw a sharp increase of content from China, between 2015 to 2020. Input from China or content from China increased 20 times in those 5 years and 3 times from Japan. We currently have about 25 organizations from India registered with Eurekaler as PIO organizations, and 20 releases from India in 2020. So there's definitely a lot of room to grow for India to be part of this sort of international exchange of information. So at Eurekaler, my main responsibilities are to oversee this distribution platform and increase the volume and diversity of membership and content. So, we as a sort of a nonprofit mission-driven organization, we really want to make sure that Eurekaler as a platform and a resource is available to both reporters and PIOs around the world, and that, scientific content from as many countries as possible are being exchanged on our platform. And a big part of that job is to make sure that I engage PIOs around the world like yourself to sort of participate in this process and to share opportunities for training. A really exciting thing that I got to do over the last 3 years was the planning, the development, and the launch of a brand new Eurekaler platform. So if you haven't used Eurekaler before, when you register, what you're logging into now is a completely new platform than the one that we built and maintained since 1996. And it was just a great opportunity to really think about how PIOs and reporters today are using information, and to make sure that we do them right by providing the right tools. So lastly, I want to share some free resources that Eurekaler and AAAS have for PIOs and scientists. So first of all, open to all. From Eurekaler, we have an archive of PIO seminars. These are panel discussions that we've held over the years with top journalists and PIOs from around the world talking about various topics. So if you go to archive.eurekaler.org/seminar, you can find full videos of those discussions completely free. We have a blog that we use to sort of communicate some of the issues that we've noticed with submissions from news releases and ways that PIOs can share their information in sort of more polished forms. So again, that's completely free as well. Feel free to peruse. Now, if you register as a Eurekaler member, as a PIO member, and again, membership is completely free for PIOs, you can also access our private PIO forum where you can post questions and answer queries from PIOs from around the world, make connections, network with other PIOs. You will receive a forthcoming article tip sheet. This is one of the sort of main services that we provide to PIOs for free by partnering with major journal publishers around the world, so that PIOs like yourself can learn about forthcoming major articles up to a week in advance, so that you have that information. You can work with scientists and provide work on news releases and provide a media strategy, and so that journalists can work on your stories under embargo and publish them at the same time as the articles. Again, the tip sheet service is completely free. You just have to register and be eligible as a PIO. And finally, we send out a monthly bulletin newsletter with tips on using the platform and just, again, general suggestions on science communication and tooltips. So to apply for PIO membership, please just go to Eurekaler and click on register, select your role as a PIO, and use the referral code HUDDLE so that we know that you're joining us from the SciComm Huddle. Please do review the eligibility criteria so that there's no confusion as to your role as a PIO before you register. And again, if you have any questions whatsoever, feel free to drop us an email. We'll be happy to respond. Now, here are some of my favorite international resources for PIOs. The STEMPRA, which stands for STEM PR Association, I think, at the UK, actually publishes a How to Be a Media Officer guide with PIOs specifically in mind. And we're collaborating with them to provide, to sort of work on even more of these guides to share with international PIOs. And STEMPRA is a lovely organization. It's a big sort of community of PIOs based in the UK who run the gamut of working at charities, government organizations and universities, and they constantly exchange the information. So definitely check them out. They have a lot of free resources. If you happen to work in the medical communications or health communication field and your scientists work with animals, speaking of animal research is a lovely, lovely resource, very useful resource. Again, they're based in the UK, but they are a lot of resources available to sort of help you talk about animal research in a way that is responsible and transparent. I personally had interactions with them when I was working at UBC, and we were experiencing sort of increased criticism of animal research at UBC, and I was very thrilled that they were able to give me some advice. So definitely check them out. The National Association for Science Writers in the United States actually have memberships from both journalists and PIOs. Again, there's free resources available there. The World Federation for Science Journalists are a sort of central organization, mainly serving journalists, but they also accept PIOs as members. They hold a World Conference for Science Journalists every 2 years. The meeting that was slated for last year was delayed, so it's actually going to be this June in Medellin, Colombia. Again, a great organization that has a lot of resources. The Association for British Science Writers, again, they run a gamut of journalists and PIOs as well, and free resources there available. And finally, the Japan SciComm Forum is an organization that Eurekaler has partnered with in the past. They do annual Japan SciComm Forum events, but they also have satellite events that sometimes have virtual components. So definitely check them out as a potential resource. We've been running fellowships for international reporters for about 20 years now, and since 2015, we've sponsored early career reporters from India to participate in the AAA's annual meeting. So if you have colleagues who are journalists, please share with them this link and encourage them to look into it and apply potentially for their for a fellowship. Here are AAA's resources for scientists, and they're available to PIOs as well. They run the gamut from communications to creating an event, promoting a scientific event, and there's toolkits about how to talk about science with different types of audiences. Again, these resources are completely free from AAAS.org for both PIOs and scientists to utilize. And finally, our AAAS annual meeting is coming up in February in Philadelphia, and there is both an in-person and virtual component. Now, if you are a working public information officer, you can register for the virtual conference completely free. So you can participate in both the scientific sessions as well as some of the newsroom activities that we offer for PIOs and reporters. So if you're a PIO or you know of a journalist who might be interested, go to the Eurekaler AAA's annual meeting online newsroom and register, apply for a PIO complimentary membership. I'll share the slides with Sarah as well, so anyone who in the session wanted these links, they'll be able to find them in there.